assessment. So we are not going to focus so much on the nuts and bolts of how to do an alternatives assessment or what's in the guide today. Really, we're going to focus on, our project assessing the guide. So I would refer anybody who has questions specifically on the guide to go to the IC2 website, and you can read and download it there. So the focus and goal of our project really was to identify gaps in the guide by reviewing 3 companies that have implemented or they're in the process of implementing alternatives. Through some of our program work we have here at the P2I, this is kind of what we do. Excuse me, we work with small, medium-sized companies that are interested in, finding alternatives, whether it's alternative products, alternative chemistries, etc., and help them assess them and implement them. So we used kind of our expertise and our staff, and then we used the staff of the companies as well. And really, we wanted to better understand the information that companies actually use to make a decision. I mean, you can go through the process of the guide, but we were curious, well, how does this work in real life? At a small company, how are they really making a decision, and what kind of information are they using to make that decision? And then what kind of information are they using to actually take an action once they make that decision? So this picture here is the front of our report, which I believe is available on the IC2 website as well. So today we're just going to go kind of through highlights of that. There's a lot more detail in the report itself. So the process we used, we identified 3 companies in our portfolio. I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail on their own slides. We conducted interviews, again, with company staff. So we talked to the people within the companies that were in charge of these projects. And then interviews with our staff as well, so P2I staff that worked on the projects. We then compared and contrasted the methods that they used to evaluate, evaluate alternatives and those same methods that are in the guide. So did they follow the methods, how, to what level, etc. And then we have some changes or recommendations really to the guide to further improve interpretation, facilitate decision-making, and even making the guide kind of more user-friendly, if you will. So jumping into the 3 case study companies we used, the first was a dry cleaner. So I manage our professional wet cleaning program, so this was a company that I'd worked with. And really their driving factor, they were looking at eliminating PERC, right, or perchloroethylene at the cleaner. So their big factor was health and environmental concerns that they were having at the cleaner. Really it was their family that were working within the shop that were having health effects, and they wanted to eliminate those. So, the owner's method for evaluating and even identifying alternatives, he visited other cleaners, so he visited other shops that were dry cleaning, attended a big trade show out in Las Vegas, and in the end visited a wet cleaner. So once he kind of narrowed down his options, he started out casting this broad net of different alternatives, and then narrowed it down to kind of, okay, he's interested in wet cleaning. Then he went and visited a wet cleaner. And the 3 critical factors for alternatives in this case were health impact, of course, since that was the driving factor, performance, the alternative had to perform at least as well, if not better than PERC, and cost, of course, had to be cost effective. So in the end, the cleaner did convert from PERC to dedicated wet cleaning. And this is the only case study that we have that we were able to get really solid financial impact results for. The other 2 were not so forthcoming in providing, exact dollar amounts, but the cleaner, we at least were able to get some information there. The plastics product manufacturer, so their driving factor was an environmental concern. So this manufacturer makes a polypropylene-based flue duct material. That's the picture that you see there. this is a product that's widely used and accepted in Europe. The challenge they had is that here in the US, it needs to meet the UL standards. Well, in order to meet the UL standards, you have to have an added flame retardant. And they are not happy with the typical flame retardants that are out on the market. They all have, as everyone's aware, environmental concerns associated with them. So that was their main concern, was to find an added flame retardant which doesn't have those same concerns. So how they identified alternatives and then assessed them, speaking with current suppliers, doing some very basic internet searches, talking with industry experts. They're talking with UL, even this is kind of a side conversation, they're talking with UL saying, can we change the standard? Does UL have ideas for how they can meet the standard, etc. And their critical factors, environmental risks and manufacturing criteria. And then once kind of an alternative meets those criteria, then they go to internal performance testing, and then finally to UL testing. And this is as of the spring. They're still seeking an alternative. They haven't been able to find something that they can kind of use in their product. And lastly, the chemical company. So this company uses MEK to essentially weld plastic pieces together. And they need to meet a new DEC, so a New York State DEC revised air regulation, which limits VOCs. So they had to go from 2,000 gallons a year of MEK down to 55 in order to meet the VOC limit. So that was really their goal. They weren't really concerned so much with environmental issues or human health. It was really to meet the regulatory requirements. So the way that alternatives were evaluated and identified here, research, consultation, physical testing, we did a lot with this company to find alternatives, expert knowledge of plastic bonding, internet searches. We talked with sales reps. We talked with the DEC themselves if they knew of alternatives. Benchmarked other adhesive applications. We did lab trials on a bunch of different alternatives, etc. And then their main critical factor really is performance. They had 7 key criteria that needed to be met. In addition to this reduced MEK value, it was really performance. That's what they were focused on. And in the end, they actually chose to go with a reasonable available control technology, so they're doing more careful handling by operators to reduce that usage down to 55 gallons per year. We were unable to find them an alternative that met their needs and also met kind of the VOC limit needs. So the next step, once we kind of collected all this data, we compared it to the modules within the Alternatives Assessment Guide. So we tried to look and say, okay, the dry cleaner, for example, how does their process line up with the different levels within each of the frameworks that are within the guide? And you can kind of see this table summarizes everything really well. And this table's in our report, and there's a lot of detail behind each one of these. There's a couple things that I'll kind of highlight or mention. The frameworks module, really only the dry cleaner followed a true framework as outlined in the guide. They evaluated hazard, cost, performance, and exposure kind of at the same time. The other two, the plastic products and chemical company, really didn't, their process really didn't fall into, any of the 3 frameworks. So they're simultaneous, sequential, and then a hybrid. So they didn't really fall within each one of those. You can see the hazard module, they all kind of perform some kind of initial screen. We actually compared the endpoints that each of the 3 case study companies used to Table 5, the hazard traits evaluated for levels 1 to 3 in the guide. And then, so that's in our report, and you can actually go through and see, here's every hazard endpoint that each one of these case study companies included in their evaluation and where it fits. what else? Oh, it was interesting that environmental endpoints were really only considered by the plastic products manufacturer. No one else really took into consideration, it wasn't a priority for them, anything having to do with the environment. They were focused on, for the chemical company, they were focused on meeting the regulatory requirements, and for the cleaner, it was really health that they were really interested in. None of the case study companies had any kind of life cycle thinking. I mean, that was very progressive for them to think about anything, you know, up chain, down chain, etc. Okay. And then here's kind of a summary of our recommendations, and I'm going to go through most of these in a lot more detail. One finding we had, we really wanted to compare or understand, you know, were there attributes that the case study companies evaluated? Is there some piece that they really included in their assessment and they thought was important that the AA guide did not include? We did not find that to be the case. We found that all the attributes that the case study companies talked about and that they used were already included in the guide. So that was a good finding. But obviously all the modules and all the pieces of the modules were not addressed by each of the case study companies. The first, you know, opportunity for improvement or recommendation is really to have a good goal and scope definition. I'm going to talk about this more on the next slide. One thing that Kim and I found that we even struggled with sometimes is that the lines between a lot of the modules are kind of blurred, and it can be challenging to understand where do I place an impact, under which module does it go, right? So this doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal, but you don't want to end up with double counting of impacts, right? And what happens is now you're getting bogged down in the minutia, in the details of, oh, where does this impact go, under which module does it go? That doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're evaluating that impact. So we saw that as a challenge, and when we saw even ourselves, like, okay, we've talked about this for a half an hour, where does this go? That's irrelevant. And we could see, especially a small company or somebody that doesn't have a lot of expertise in doing alternatives assessment, having similar issues, getting bogged down in where does this go, am I double counting? They could easily double count something and not realize it. So that could be an issue. One way to kind of get past that, or one recommendation, is to develop what we have been calling a cheat sheet or a table, you know, that clearly outlines here are the impacts that are included within each module. And then how to interpret results and make decisions. I think everyone understands that's kind of a challenge with the guide, is now at the end, you know, you go through this life cycle, or excuse me, you go through this alternatives assessment and you have a whole bunch of data, but then how do we use it to actually make decisions? So we have some examples, you know, coming up that's kind of linked to the displaying results to facilitate decision making. So we have that coming up in some slides. And then, you know, because we work so much with kind of small, medium companies, we kind of took that angle as we're reading through the guide and even as we're going through the case study companies. The guide itself meets the unique needs of kind of large companies, businesses who have resources internally, or they have the ability to get external resources and have the time to kind of go through the process. I really struggled with, you know, kind of a smaller company, or frankly, even some of our P2I folks here. You know, if I gave this to them and said, okay, the next project that you do, you need to follow this guide or follow pieces of this guide, I think they would say no, because it's long and it's overwhelming, which it's great that it's so comprehensive, but we think there's an opportunity to have maybe a streamlined assessment process, something like that for kind of small, medium companies. So to go into a little bit more detail for these are the three, we have three that we called out as priority improvement areas. The first one is goal and scope guidance. As you know, anybody that's done an alternatives assessment is aware, you know, the goal really shapes the criteria that you're using, the priority levels of the criteria, which drives how the results are displayed and how you really make a decision. And what's kind of missing is this focus on how do you craft a goal, how do you craft a scope, how do you clearly define both of these up front. I think some good practical examples of well thought out, you know, goal and scope statements and poor ones would provide some good resources for practitioners. So that could just be, you know, a simple standalone, maybe it's a 1 or 2 page document, or it could be integrated within the guide itself. Secondly, having the streamlined alternatives assessment process for small and medium enterprises. As I was mentioning, you know, it kind of lacks utility for smaller companies, but they still have these situations where they need to do an alternatives assessment. They need to find something to replace a material that they're currently using. So our main recommendation is develop some kind of streamlined process. You know, we still want to encourage people to use a systematic approach. We don't want them to pick up something that's, you know, 120 pages, however long the guide is, and say, there's no way I can do this, and then kind of go off and do their own thing. We still want them to do a systematic approach. But is there a way to still do that, but maybe have a shortened version or a simpler, if you will, if that's, you know, a better word for it. And then to go along with it, having, you know, a cheat sheet or table that outlines the impacts included within each module. And then that just makes sure that all the relevant impacts are included. It could be a way, you know, for a practitioner as they've kind of already set their goal and scope, okay, let me check it against this cheat sheet. Am I missing something that I should be including, etc. And then lastly, some guidance to display results. These are just some examples, and really our recommendation is to put these in as examples. You know, these are not, this is the way to do it. These are just examples and methods to do it. You know, having a set of yes, no, or pass-fail criteria for each of the modules, and then determining criteria for each of the modules and evaluating them relative to the alternative. So it could be kind of a better than, less than, equal, you know, plus, minus, equal, etc. And both of those are really good for a preliminary screen. So you have, you know, a large set of alternatives and you want to narrow them down to some subset that kind of continues on. And then the last bullet is really better for those alternatives that pass the preliminary screening. So developing a set of high, moderate, low criteria. So now you're kind of bucketing them for each of the modules. And then of course, even once you do that, there'll have to be some value judgments, you know, applied to determine, well, if this is high but this is low, how, you know, how do you weigh a high, medium, and low, etc. So with that, I will end for now and turn it back over to Topher.
Great. Thank you very much. Just a moment here while we... All right. So thank you again, Kate. And Kate, I will actually just rely on you for a moment to verify that you're seeing the
yep, I see it. And
okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so yes, switching gears, everybody, and again, just for those of you, I know there are a few folks that came in late. We got these two presentations today. We're going to hold the questions until the end. So I'm sure that some of you have some questions or thoughts for Kate, and please hold those. We will get to them all at the end. So I'm going to talk now for a bit about life cycle considerations in alternatives assessment. And you know, at least a few of you may have seen a presentation I gave a little 15 months or so ago at the AA symposium in the Washington, D.C. area, and at least some of this should look pretty familiar to you. So just to give you a really brief sense for what I'm going to cover here, just sort of clarify what the objective of this project was, a brief discussion just by way of background on why to consider life cycle in AA, do a little bit of comparison of life cycle assessment and alternative assessment, and then talk about some suggestions, recommendations for integration of life cycle considerations into AA, and as it says, recommendations for research and method development in alternative assessment specifically. So this is a project that was funded by UMass Lowell and the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, and is really intended to identify questions and research needs, again, in the context of AA, not LCA, to help better integrate life cycle considerations into AA, into alternative assessment. And again, just the sort of footnote here is just to clarify that while I certainly will talk in part in this presentation about life cycle assessment, the bigger picture really is a broader concept of life cycle thinking or life cycle considerations, which could include life cycle assessment, but does not necessarily. This just really briefly, because I tend to assume that in this audience it's not necessary to go into this in great detail, but in a nutshell, the answer as to why consider life cycle in AA is precisely to help avoid regrettable substitution, which is, of course, what AA is all about in the first place. And I think perhaps it goes without saying in this context that for alternative assessment for a field whose goal is to replace chemicals of concern with safer alternatives, the more we can do to look beyond just the specific functional use to consider other life cycle impact categories or facets of the life cycle, if you will, it's a good thing to do, right? We don't want to substitute one chemical for another that appears to be safer in a limited context or a limited perspective, and then find out that it is responsible for increased worker health and safety issues upstream or downstream, or is destroying the ozone layer or what have you. So again, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but hopefully this is clear and everyone's on board with this. So what I'm next going to do is just do a little bit of comparison of life cycle and really of life cycle assessment specifically with alternative assessment in the following several slides. Just want to clarify, this is not intended as some sort of pro-con comparison. It's really just kind of trying to point out relative strengths and weaknesses of these two. And again, this is a context in which I am, for the most part, focusing on LCA. And if you will, I would say think of, or perhaps I should say that in this context, I'm sort of thinking of LCA as the gold standard, so to speak, for life cycle thinking, right? It's sort of the most formal and structured and comprehensive method for applying life cycle or evaluating life cycle considerations. So the first point to make, right, is that LCA and AA ask different questions, and so it shouldn't be any great surprise to any of us that they tend to give different answers. Life cycle assessment is, of course, by definition, focused on total impacts of a product or process across its life cycle, whereas AA has been developed really to look at safer alternatives to a specific chemical or material in a specific functional use. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but again, this is actually quite a simple product map or flow diagram for life cycle assessment. But in this case, it's a sort of a classic from EPA's LCA 101 document focused on a bar soap. But again, the point is that you're looking at impacts across a whole range of processes, from resource extraction to production to use, transportation, disposal, what have you. And in contrast, of course, alternative assessment might actually be focused on one very sort of specific and relatively small node, if you will, in that overall life cycle, such as, you know, if we have a concern about a particular fragrance that's used in this soap, you know, what better alternatives are there? So again, it's from just a broad picture, a comparison of those two. Okay, so life cycle assessment, of course, is intended to give perspective on these trade-offs across this broad array of impacts, whereas AA delves deeply into human and, to some degree, ecological toxicity in these specific use scenarios. This next comparison point is, in some respects, very similar to, or almost the inverse of the previous, right? Which is to say that because LCA is looking broadly, it tends to do a relatively poor job of estimating specific human and ecological hazards for chemicals, whereas alternative assessment, because it's looking very narrowly, tends to do a relatively poor job of evaluating those broader concerns, which is precisely why we're trying to figure out how to improve that. And again, some of you have seen this diagram before. This is because I'm a fairly visual thinker. I tend to think of it in this sense that life cycle assessment, again, is sort of the plane and is a way of encompassing or mapping and evaluating assessments across the entire life cycle, whereas AA is really looking at each node, say, in that product map and looking at the alternatives that might exist for the chemicals used in that node. Another point of comparison is that life cycle assessment tends to focus on emissions, right? So it could be emissions that cause eutrophication, emissions that cause climate change, what have you, from processes in a product's life cycle. AA tends to be more focused on chemicals sort of in the use phase. I mean, this is not always the case, of course, but it tends to be true. And finally, you know, I think life cycle assessment is typically not hierarchical, and as I say here, encompasses all these criteria jointly, whereas alternative assessment, at least as it's practiced, often is at least semi-hierarchical, right? This gets into the sort of sequential versus simultaneous application that Kate referenced, and you know, I think typically most of the guidance for AAs suggests that people at least do a sort of hybrid or semi-hierarchical, apply AA in a hybrid or semi-hierarchical manner. So, some suggestions for integrating life cycle assessment into alternative assessment. In general, I think the advisory group that contributed to this project agreed, for the most part, that the earlier that you can incorporate life cycle thinking, and again, this is not necessarily life cycle assessment, but the earlier that you can incorporate a life cycle perspective or life cycle thinking into alternative assessment, the better. So, you know, the sort of overarching suggestion here for practitioners is to do that, and of course, if necessary, you can apply a more rigorous life cycle assessment, or you know, if later in the assessment, if you're still, for example, having trouble distinguishing which of a set of alternatives is truly the preferred alternative. Some more sort of specific items of guidance to go along with that. Understanding and mapping the product life cycles at the beginning of the alternative assessment. I want to sort of touch on some of what Kate was talking about in terms of the importance of doing goal and scope definition, again, to borrow a phrase that tends to be associated with life cycle assessment, but I think is also very relevant in AA. And you know, I think clarifying, understanding the landscape, the map, if you will, of your product and the supply chain as a part of that goal and scoping exercise is really key and can really help identify potential hotspots in the supply chain that you would want to take into consideration. Related to that, of course, is the importance of supply chain transparency. If you don't know what's in the chemicals or the materials that you're purchasing from your suppliers, it's hard, of course, to evaluate them. Understanding synthetic history of chemicals is really important. So, you know, understanding what processes are used to produce the chemicals that are going into your products can be valuable. An interesting point I think that came out in the discussions of the advisory group was the role of geography in these kinds of impacts. And the point here is essentially that, you know, in some cases, impacts associated with a given chemical may have more to do with how and where it is produced than inherent to the chemical itself. So this may especially be true, for example, of issues related to climate change, or, you know, say mercury impacts from the production of electricity used to manufacture something. You know, if that product or that chemical is produced in a place where there's, say, a lot more hydro or nuclear or even natural gas in the mix as opposed to coal, it could have a very different, the overall effects could appear to be different. So consider geography. And of course, and again, to sort of touch on some of what Kate was talking about, the IC2 guide was certainly, I think, designed, and general AA guidance is designed to be flexible and recognize that different practitioners are going to need to apply the methodology differently to suit their needs. But of course, it's good to remind them that that highlights the importance of clearly documenting the assumptions that you make and the way in which you are applying this process to your own assessment, so that other people can appropriately understand and interpret what you have done. So that's the sort of two sides of the coin as adaptability and transparency. So recommendations for research and method development, and again, focused on alternatives assessment here. And I'm just going to sort of cover these at a high level, and we can get into them in more detail if you like during the discussion. The first is to develop screening methods to highlight life cycle stages and impact categories that contribute most to differences among chemicals. So in a sense, the idea here is really to try and help people find relatively easy ways of identifying hotspots, in the product life cycle or in the supply chain. I think this very clearly falls into the easier said than done category. Develop guidance focused on goal and scope definition in AA. I've already talked about that. I don't think I'll belabor that for the moment. Enhance and encourage training in and experience with life cycle assessment as well as AA. Again, this seems to me to be relatively self-explanatory, but certainly among members of the project advisory group and other practitioners that I know, folks who have the benefit of doing life cycle assessments and are sort of comfortable and used to thinking about these sort of product maps, process flow diagrams, and envisioning an entire supply chain for a product, seem to have a somewhat easier time envisioning some of that as they are doing alternatives assessment. So sort of cross-training in these disciplines certainly seems like a great thing to the extent that we can do that. Developing methods to help easily and relatively cheaply integrate life cycle impact assessments or LCIA data into AA. The idea here again is that in cases where an alternatives assessment perhaps does not produce a really clear answer for which of a set of alternatives is preferable, there may be ways to use data, especially from public life cycle inventory databases, to get some additional perspective on the trade-offs among alternatives, well short of having to do a full life cycle assessment. So trying to find, methods to do that quickly and easily. And a last point is certainly there are some folks who like to point out that we are still much better at doing hazard assessment focused on humans than on a lot of non-human organisms in the environment, and there's still a lot of need to improve our methodologies focused on non-human organisms. So I just want to take a moment here to thank certainly the members of the project advisory group. I will show you who they are in a moment. I also want to thank Joel Tickner and Molly Jacobs, who have provided a really wonderful amount of guidance with the project and sort of distilling a lot of the learnings, so to speak. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production and UMass Lowell for providing funding for this project. These are the members of the project advisory group. They were very helpful, including Kate. And let's move to the discussion. I'm going to try and unmute people's lines. We are fortunate in that we have, a small enough group, and again, those of you who've been on these webinars before know that I much prefer to hear directly from you, your questions. So I am going to go through and, to the extent that I'm able, unmute people. If you are in a noisy spot or simply want to stay muted, you should be able to mute yourself again using the controls. And if I'm unable to mute you, I'm sorry. In some cases, I can't always make it work. But if that's the case, and you have a question, please type it into the chat box, and I will read it. So. All right. So again, I've unmuted everybody that I am able to. So please, if you have questions, speak up. And thank you again for attending. Well, okay, I'll tell you what, I will certainly ask Kate. I have a question for you, which is, do you have a sense for, I assume you know, in at least some of these cases, did any of the people or the companies who made up your case studies, were they aware, had they seen, whether it was the IC2 AA guide or another guide? I mean, were they really even thinking about it in those terms, as far as you know? Were they trying to follow? Okay.
That's a very easy answer, and the answer is no. And to be honest, I even find that with some professional staff. I mean, even here, I've been involved in the AA work group long enough now that I think everyone within P2I at least knows what AA is and knows the guide exists. But I think, beyond that, companies definitely are not aware. At least again, we're dealing with small, medium-sized companies. We're not dealing with the large multinational corporations for the most part. That may be more aware and may have it on their radar, but in general, no. I would say people aren't really aware that whether it's the guide or any tool exists to help them evaluate alternatives. I think that's why a lot of companies come to us, as experts and say, okay, I need an alternative. help me even decide, how do I know that this one's better than that one? You know, in terms of environment and health.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think that's a challenge and a hurdle too, is how do you get this, if the guide is going to be meant for that group, right, small, medium-sized companies, I think there's two hurdles. How do you pare it down a little bit and make it a little bit more easily digestible? And then how do you get it out to people and even make them aware that, hey, this process exists, this guidance exists, even this network of professionals exists that are here to help you do this.
Right. Other questions? Well, Kate, I'll ask a follow-on to that, which is, do you have an opinion as to, you know, the kinds of resources? I mean, certainly, I guess it goes without saying, given that you talked about them, you know, in the case study paper and in your presentation about, you know, the cheat sheet idea, for example. Yeah. I'm wondering if you think that, you know, are there, do you think, you know, examples, so in a sense case studies, but not maybe perhaps not case studies quite of the kind that you're talking about, but you know, if the company that you worked with that was doing the welding of plastic parts with methyl ethyl ketone had been able to see, you know, an alternative assessment done by another company or another, you know, a consultant theoretically that also was looking at, you know, if not precisely the same, you know, chemical and application, a similar one. Do you think, how helpful would that be, you know, as opposed to say to a sort of, you know, like a very simple, almost, you know, computer-based kind of, some of you heard me before, you know, sort of talk about almost like a TurboTax kind of model of, you know, something that it's simple enough that it can really, there's some expert judgment built into software that would walk people through it. I mean, do you have an opinion as to what kinds of resources along those lines might be most helpful for these kinds of companies?
I think something like that may be helpful. I think it may be something as simple as going through each of the however many modules there are, 7, 8, 9, and saying, are there key questions to ask within these modules? And not a whole page of questions. You know, are there key questions that really should be asked, you know, for each of the modules, and then that kind of guides how you do the assessment. I think all the information is already in the guide. It's just trying to pull out the key concepts. That was kind of my thought, is if you had this other document that had the key concepts, so then if somebody really wanted to deep dive, let's say they wanted to deep dive into exposure, for example, they can still reference the guide and read the whole section on exposure, right? If they want to deep dive into it, or if they want to deep dive into multiple modules, but otherwise, you know, each module has a page or something max that describes the module. Here are the key questions. Here are some even resources to help you, you know, evaluate the information within the module.
Right.
I think there could be some really creative brainstorming around how to set something up like that, with the goal of it being, you know, it's for kind of these small, medium-sized companies. They don't have months to do an analysis. You know, it's got to be done in a month or two to make a business decision, those kinds of things. You know, because all of these, I don't want to call them smaller decisions, but they kind of are. It's like we visited a company yesterday who they use 5 or 6 different cleaning products all throughout their plant. And the woman we met with really wants to narrow it down to 1 or 2. Well, she's not going to spend a year evaluating different cleaners to use within her facility. She wants to do something like that in a month and have it be done, right? So to have some kind of streamlined process for her to go through to say, okay, now here's some alternatives that I found. Well, how do I really know which one is the best environmentally? Or, environmental and health, when you look at it that way. So that's where my mind is going. How do we have a tool for those kinds of decisions to help people make those kinds of decisions? If it's going to be a major decision that impacts your business, then of course you're going to go through something more thorough. If you're going to change a product formulation, then it's going to change and you're going to do more. But if it's something that's kind of a lower impact decision, that's the way I want to word it. Having something that's a little bit more streamlined, that still hits the important impacts, but then you're not focused on irrelevant pieces too. You don't want to chase data that doesn't matter, right? Yep.
Okay, so Kate, let me ask you. So I've gotten several questions come in sort of through the questions pane.
Okay.
That I want to ask. One question is, someone is asking if you are familiar with EcoValuate's alternative assessment tool.
No, I am not.
Okay. So yeah, and again, obviously at least one person on the call is EcoValuate is actually a supporting member of the IC2 based in Portland, Oregon, and they've developed an online tool to help sort of structure AAs. It certainly doesn't. It's not at the level of really doing all of it for you. I think it's really an organizational tool, but it's something that people may want to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Another question, Kate, for you was just a question about the budget for the example of the chemical company, which I think is the MEK, the methyl ketone example.
Yeah.
Do you have that information?
You mean budget for them to make the change, or for us to do the work? Or you don't know?
I believe for them to make the change. So Suzanne, this was your question, and I think you're unmuted if you want to clarify. If you're on the line.
I'll assume you mean that it's kind of the budget or the cost for them to make the change.
I think so.
They were willing to spend a little bit of money. I don't know exactly how much. I mean, I have to go back and look through notes to see exactly how much. If we could find an alternative for them that had been proven. We did find an alternative that was what was it? It was a MEK chemical blend, so it had a very small amount of MEK in it, but it hadn't been proven. It was something that had been proven in a different application, different plastics, so our engineers here said, well, this should also work in this application. You'd have to do some testing. And they were not willing to invest any time or effort in testing that different chemical. They just wanted to, put in controls essentially to reduce the amount of MEK that they were using.
Okay. Let's see. So I had one question sort of about LCA, which was essentially just pointing out that if AAs are already too onerous for small companies, how could we expect them also to do LCA? And I think certainly that is an excellent point. And again, this is part of why I was trying to clarify that a lot of the goal here is to figure out how to give people some relatively simple and straightforward techniques to incorporate life cycle thinking into assessments without having to go to a full LCA. But clearly it is a real challenge, right? I mean, it's for companies that are already struggling. to do AA as Kate has described, just straight out of a guide, folding in life cycle is certainly a daunting challenge. So that's an excellent point. Let's see. Sorry, I'm going to try and get to a couple of others here.
We may be on mute, Topher, if you want to get out.
No, go ahead. Is that you, Alex?
Yep, it's Alex here out in Washington State. I'm in a room with three other people, so we have several questions from Washington State. But first one is for Kate. Kate, a quick question for you, and this is sort of my personal opinion. I don't know if the IC2 work agrees with it, but the IC2 guide was never intended to be a document that you hand in and give to companies and expect them to implement. It was more a resource for the individual states to then decide what to pull from the guide and use in their individual states. And the reason why it's so broad and encompassing is because there are so many different requirements in the different states. We had to try to make it as big and broad as possible to cover all needs. But did you look at, for example, Washington State has come up with a state-only guide, which went into the IC2 guide and pulled out what it thought was the most important requirements, and it was basically intended, it's actually in the title, for small and medium-sized companies. Did you look at that sort of guide and see maybe how that fit in with some of your examples?
No, Alex, I didn't. And I agree that I'm not, I agree that the guide needs to be comprehensive, right, the way that it is. It's just, and I think you're kind of saying the same thing, right? The way it is, it's not made for a small, medium-sized company. So we will definitely look at the Washington State resource. Thank you for that.
Right. Well, and just a little bit of background. It's only about 10 pages because originally what we had done was pull the actual pieces from the IC2 guide and put it into a separate document. But then it was decided just to refer to the IC2 guide. So that if changes are made to the guide, we don't have to worry about changing our document. But you may want to take a look at it, and if you want to see the larger version, I'd be more than happy to share it and to get input of whether or not it's better for small companies to refer to the larger document or to pull out the salient points and put it in its own small one to make it more easily understood, because that was an ongoing discussion we had in Washington State.
Okay.
So any input we have on that would be appreciated.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
This is Lynn Coleman, also in Washington State. I have a question for Topher. Do you have any?
Sure. Go ahead, Lynn.
When you say one way to sort of incorporate these two techniques is to understand and map the life cycle at the beginning of an AA, do you have any specific resources that you would recommend to do that?
So the short answer is no, but that's not to suggest that there aren't resources out there that would be suitable. It's just something, to be very honest, that I haven't yet been able to really look into to the extent of having a great answer for you. There again, I think some of it depends. Some of it, I think, in part is contextual. So. And again, I assume that we're talking about something well short of really getting into full life cycle assessment.
Yes.
So I know that there are tools that exist in sort of specific contexts. And so, for example, my former colleague Minal Mistry, who now works at Oregon DEQ, is on the line, and Minal did a lot of work in previous years developing a sort of LCA-based tool focused on packaging materials that I think could be an example of this kind of thing, but is again in sort of applicable in a fairly specific context. Again, the short answer is I don't have a great answer for you, and there may not be a sort of one-size-fits-all tool to do that. But it's a great question for future research.
Topher, Alex here with a sort of follow-up and related question. Did you look at all of and I'm sorry, I'm turning into a harper here on the IC2 guide, because we do have a life cycle section module in the guide. because we tried to wrestle with some of these things as well. So did you look at that in terms of addressing some of these issues? And a recommendation that I would like to throw out there is that it might be nice, as Kate has done, to actually find somebody to work with as a case study to see if we can, because no matter how much we do it in terms of documentation and tools, et cetera, we need real life case studies, examples.
Hi.
So I would have liked to have seen that as a recommendation as well, that we need to work on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great suggestion, Alex, and thank you so much. I mean, the short answer again is that certainly
They're just running over.
I refreshed my memory. I did look at the lifecycle module in the AA guide during the course of this project, but yeah, I absolutely agree that doing one or perhaps a handful of case studies focused specifically on life cycle, as Kate has done, would be a really great suggestion for a project, and might in fact be something that the AA work group, the IC2 AA work group wants to think about. So thank you for that.
What I would recommend though too is to say not just limited to AA, but it might be nice to have a case study where you try to correlate alternative assessments and LCA as well to see how we can bring the two of them together to some extent, because I would think that would be of particular importance to California, which is trying to do, I forget what they call it. It's not called alternative assessment. It's called alternative analysis. I think that's the right term.
Yes.
With a life cycle component. So, I think it would be nice to do something along that line to help both California, and we can learn from the practical example as well.
Right.
And this is Lynn. It seems like just one baby step in doing that is whenever an AA is done and also in the context of establishing good goals and scope, is to very clearly define a functional unit for an AA, and to take the LCA concept of a functional unit and make sure that that's incorporated in the AA.
Right. So if you'll forgive me, it's 4 minutes past the hour, and I know that people may need to go. I mean, a few people have dropped off already. I would propose that we, for anyone who's interested and has the time, we can spend just a few more minutes. There were a few more questions that came in that we could try and answer, but that we restrict it to just a few more minutes, and then to certainly sort of remind and invite people to follow up with me or with Kate offline if you still had questions that didn't get answered, because it would be great to keep the conversation going.
Well, another question from Washington State for Kate. How much time did these companies spend, kind of elapsed time from when they started thinking about this stuff to when they decided they were finished?
It varies. I mean, I can speak to the dry cleaner because I managed that project. I would say he really started looking in the spring, and he had his wet cleaning machine all installed by like Thanksgiving. So that was his time frame. That's actually a long project duration for us at P2I. So typically we're looking at like 2 to 3 months to do a project. Some of these companies do some work in-house first. So typically they, like the chemical company, for example, that wanted the MEK substitute, they did a little bit of work on their own, didn't really find anything, and then came to us and asked for some help. So I don't know how long, they spent looking and how diligent they really were. But typically it's 2-3 months. By the time that's kind of the time of, okay, let's have an initial conversation around this being an issue to some kind of decision is made.
Kate, this is Terry Goldberg, and I have a follow-up question to that one.
Yep.
So I think it's really helpful to have all these case studies that you've done. But when I looked at it, I read through your document, it struck me that they're sort of like what Topher's done, looking at how to incorporate LCA thinking into AA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I come from a tradition of pollution prevention, and we often have thought about pollution prevention assessment as a methodology. And it strikes me that the work that was done in some of your case studies were really pollution prevention assessments. And I think there isn't necessarily a bright line between what we typically think of as a pollution prevention assessment and an alternatives assessment, but it might be worth thinking about that a little more because, as Alex said, I don't think the AA guide was ever designed with a dry cleaner in mind. I think that's really where a pollution prevention assessment approach has been, you know, what we typically have applied to a company like that and the decisions they need to make about their processes. I mean, pollution prevention assessments have tended to be much more focused on the process of making something or the process of delivering a service, as opposed to necessarily what's put in the final product. But, you know, there isn't a clear, bright line there, but it seems to me that we're blurring these distinctions and maybe we need to be clearer about them. You know, when is a pollution prevention assessment really the tool that's needed, you know, and how to distinguish between these different approaches? It might be a useful thing to think about. I don't know what your comments are about that.
No, I think that's fair.
And someone following up on, well, it's slightly different. Alex again, Howden, Washington State. I'm sorry, Washington seems to be monopolizing, but I had a quick question for Kate again. Listening to your presentation, I was wondering if you've had a chance at all to look at the update for the exposure module that the AA work group has come up with and is currently out for review. The reason is because a couple of your recommendations, things like checklist and examples, we included in that update. And we actually tried to take the example that was in the National Academy of Sciences framework document and convert that into an example in the IC2 exposure module update. So it would be interesting to, if you have not had a chance to look at it, for you to look at it and see from your perspective of your needs of checklists and examples, whether or not what we're doing there is in the right direction.
Okay, sure. I know I had good intentions to look at it, Alex, but we're near the end of our fiscal year, too, so.
You're not the only one, I'm sure, that has good intentions.
Yes, I know. No, thanks for the reminder. No,
okay, thanks.
Yep.
So, Kate, I have one more question for you that's come in through the question box, which was, could you talk just briefly about or describe what drove the companies that you profile in your case study to ask for P2I's help? You know, do you know, like, were they focused on compliance issues, you know, product process improvement? You know, is it their own sort of continuous improvement processes within the companies? Could you just comment a little bit on that, like what drove them to you?
Sure. So what drove the cleaner to us was the human health impacts, right, of PERC. Is that so it was the owner that came to me and he said his wife refuses to work in the shop because she thinks it's making her sick. So he needs to do something about it, and he doesn't know, right? There's all these alternatives out there, and how do I know what's really the best one? And he didn't want to go to a vendor because, you know, in his words, a vendor is just trying to sell me something. So how do I know that what they're trying to sell me is really the best option for me? So that was the cleaner. The chemical companies, so with the methyl ethyl ketone, they had a regulatory driver, right? The DEC told them there's a new VOC limit, you're not meeting it, you need to find a way to meet that limit. So, and they needed help to be able to do that. So that's why they came to us. And then the third one was, let's see, the plastic products manufacturer. They came to us initially for something else. They wanted to do, I think, some kind of environmental assessment, life cycle assessment, something to show that their product is better than their competitors. And through conversations with them, it came up that, you know, we're looking for this flame retardant and we can't find one. So can you help us do that as well, kind of as part of a bigger project? So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we should wrap it up. It's you know, approaching quarter past the hour, and I do want to respect people's time. So first of all, again, let me thank you, Kate, for joining us today and for presenting your case study, which it's great. It's just wonderful to have this kind of work for us to think about and chew on and to give us something to work with. So thank you again for taking the time to present.
Sure.
And just to remind folks that, you know, we are continuing to plan webinars. There's a pair of webinars that we're in the process of finalizing the details. The first should happen at the end of June, and the second a couple of weeks later. And these are webinars that our colleagues at Walmart are helping us put together, focused on issues around ingredient disclosure in the supply chain. So stay tuned for more information about those. I think those will both should be really interesting, coming up here again, end of this month and sort of early to mid-July. The pair go together. So, and we will of course have probably at that point to probably take sort of a summer break and be back in September with yet more webinars for the late summer and fall. So until then, thank you so much for joining us, and do take care, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.